Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. In this episode, I'm going to interview Bob Irving. We're going to discuss our emphasis on creative coding or computing for leisure, fostering engagement with coding or CS, improving pedagogy over time, video games and learning, all sorts of topics that I hope you find interesting. Now, in this particular episode, there are a ton of links in the show notes. You can access them most likely through your podcast app by actually going to the description and clicking on the link in there, or simply visiting jaredoleary.com and searching for the show notes on the CSK8 podcast page. And without further ado, I'd like to begin this episode with Bob introducing himself.
Okay, well, hi, I'm Bob Irving. I teach middle school computer science at the Porter Gaud School. It's an independent school in Charleston, South Carolina. I've actually been teaching longer than I've been teaching computer science, but I started out as an English and history teacher and segued into computer science about 15, 20 years ago. And I've been doing that ever since. And so I really have the dream gig. That's the way I look at it.
Can you tell me the story of how you made that segue? Like what led you to want to do that and how did you do it?
Sure. Well, I think part of it was around the year, it was the dot-com bubble. I'm sure that some people will remember that. And that was everything was going to take off and people who were in the tech industry were going to be bazillionaires. And I had been teaching for a while at a boarding school and I was actually getting a little bit burnt out. And I thought, well, this will be my segue into a life of unimaginable wealth. And so I think we all know how that worked out. But anyway, frankly, I was one of those early adopters with every technology. So I had a computer, I had a Commodore 64, which I realize dates me incredibly, but I had a Commodore 64 and I was always trying to figure out ways to use computers in my classes and things like that. So I always loved that part. And so when I was looking for maybe the next thing, that appealed to me. And I went back to school. This was actually in Canada, and there was a school, sadly, that no longer exists called Information Technology Institute, which offered a 10-month program, an intensive program for people who already had bachelor degrees to try to reskill them so that they could go into the tech field. And so I did that. And it was application development and databases and, teamwork and all that kind of stuff. And it was a fabulous program and it was really great. And their pedagogy really was very influential in the way I teach computer science today. But I went back to school and I did that course. And by the time the 10 months was up, the frost was starting to settle on all of that excitement about the bubble. So I spent about a year or two trying to break into the tech field and not really being terribly successful. And I thought, well, if worst comes to worst, I guess I can go back to teaching. And that's kind of what happened. And strangely enough, I guess the time off was the time that I needed to just kind of get my mojo back and to get back into it. And so by the time I did that, and then I got all kinds of responses because obviously I had been a teacher and then I had the tech piece rather than somebody who was just breaking into the tech field and had the teaching piece. So I got back into it and started teaching computer science. I did a lot of technology integration for the first few years, but I think my heart was really more in actually making things than helping the teachers make things. And so anyway, that's how I got back into it. And I've been in middle school computer science since then, and that's what I'm doing now. So,
at the nonprofit that I work for, we work with a lot of teachers who have maybe been teaching for a while, but who have never experienced computer science or programming in any capacity. So there's a lot of hesitation and fear around well, how am I supposed to teach this thing? So what kind of recommendations might you give for an educator who is new to teaching CS?
That's a good question. And I think a lot of that would depend on their learning styles and what they're comfortable with. But this is really the golden age of computer science education.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at it, there's so many things online. Just looking at code.org, for instance, or any of those, CS for All, there's a dozen at least of them out there, and you can do that. But I do think that there is something to be gained by, if you can, finding some program where you can devote yourself to that. And that's what that 10-month period did for me. I mean, I was immersed, really baptized into this. I think that was a really good experience for me because I went into it thinking, well, I really know how to work computers. So I think this should be pretty easy for me. And I discovered very early on that there's not the same thing. You might be pretty good with managing computers and know your way around an operating system, but that's not the same as coding.
Yep.
So you've got to get that into your toolkit, I think. But there's so much support material out there, and there's so many on ramps, from scratch on up to whatever, and so much help that I think that it's way more doable now than it was a few years ago.
So was it kind of like a boot camp that you were a part of?
I guess it was. I've seen that terminology. I suppose it was like a boot camp, but it was 10 months. What they did was they divided us into teams. We had a cohort of about 50 or 60 people, I think. And you were in a team for 2 to 3 months and you did application development. So it was really kind of business oriented. And you had to learn how to interact with other people, and you had deliverables, and it ended with an actual business presentation that you gave. But the great thing about it was they divided the time fairly equally between instruction, but all the teachers were called facilitators. That was the first clue. And I remember the first day when they got us all together and they said, I'll never forget this. The person in charge said, everything we're going to teach you will be obsolete in about 3 years. And I remember thinking, wow, I'm really spending a lot of money to get obsolete.
But you're going to make millions, right?
Well, they didn't actually promise that. But what he did say was, in this field, you have to reskill, retool, relearn
Yep.
all the time. And so what we're going to do is we're going to teach you how to learn and how to teach yourself and how to find the resources, because you will be doing that over and over and over again in this field. And he started to list the technologies that they taught 2 or 3 years before. And of course, we hadn't heard of any of them,
Right.
So it was a little bit terrifying, but they really had a good way. And so the facilitators would say, you would go to them and you say, okay, I'm really stuck on this thing in Java. I don't know how to make this happen. And they would answer your question with a question always. And they would say something like, well, where do you think you could find some answers for that? And, we'd all roll our eyes and we'd say, we're paying a lot of money, obviously, but their thing was, no, you need to learn how to learn and how to teach yourself. I mean, we're giving you some instruction, but when you get, you've got teammates here, you've got online resources, you've got all this, and they did say, look, if you're finally getting to the point where everybody's in tears, call us in. We will do this, but that's not going to be our first response. And as frustrating as it was, it's been gold for me ever since. And I've had to reskill, and the languages that I'm learning now weren't prevalent back then.
Yep.
But I can do it. And I do that with my middle school students. Now, I don't do it quite as harshly, I suppose, because I think they're a little bit more nervous about that kind of thing. But I will often answer questions with questions and try to help them to build their learning. Because, I always tell them, if I'm the answer to your question, then first of all, there's 18 or 20 of you in the class. I can't get to you all. And you're going to sit waiting for me to be the solution. And that's not going to work. We can't have that. So I try to teach them to find other resources. And I said, I will help you. And you're certainly welcome to come in for extra help. If you want one-on-one, I can provide that, but I can't provide it in class to the extent that you might want it.
Yeah, I actually was just speaking to somebody who's going to appear in an interview 2 weeks before this. We were talking about the same thing. Like, you have to be able to teach yourself. That's like the number one skill that you can learn.
Yep.
It's not necessarily learning a specific language or learning a specific concept or practice, but just learning how to learn in general.
Yeah, they'll all be obsolete shortly. So it's funny because one of the things that drew me to computer science is that I am one of those lifelong learners that every school says they're trying to create. I mean, I'm just cursed with this, I suppose, but
or blessed.
I love or whatever, but I love to learn. And the thing, as much as I loved English and history, I mean, Hamlet never changed ever. Right? We didn't have to learn Hamlet in a new language, or there was not some new Shakespearean play, every year or two that we had to learn. It was all, after a while, you got it down. And so it wasn't that it was boring, because, great literature is always great, and, exciting history is always exciting. But after a while, it was kind of the same thing. And so I wanted something that was always going to be fresh. There's some days I I really ask myself, you sure that's what you want, Bob? Because, today it's this and you don't have an answer. But yeah, all in all, I would say definitely, if you're that person that loves to learn, this is the field.
How has your experiences in other subject areas kind of informed how you approach computer science?
Gosh, that's a good question.
Thank you.
I I know one thing that I actually minored in a dead language in college. I minored in Greek,
Huh.
and which has been completely useless ever since, of course. But the whole grammatical thinking and syntactical thinking has been really helpful for
Okay.
me. The other side where I come to it is the whole idea of creative coding. I suppose, having been a humanities person, I do get the humanities. I do get creativity. I do get expression and soul, or whatever you want to call it. I love to bring that part of it in and marry that with coding. So I think that's a big thing for me. I do find a lot of computer science is very much based on business, which is fine. But coding is just one way to express yourself, one means of self-expression. Why couldn't it be just for art? Or I don't mean just, but for art or for music or for dance or whatever, not just for making money. So that's informed me a lot too.
Yeah, I think coding and computer science for leisure is something that is just often not discussed because it's such a lucrative field. So the focus is on helping kids get jobs, which is great. Like
Hmm.
that might be a priority for some people, but there's also just something to be said about learning for the sake of enjoyment or for leisure. And I think CS can be one of those things.
Yeah, I would totally agree. And at our school, you'll find that in our computer science program, we have athletes and the debate team and the cheerleaders and all kinds of people in our computer science program, because our cell is, look, you may not be a full-time computer science person. You may not go into that, but maybe you're going to go into marine biology or language teaching or something. And if you have this coding piece in your toolkit, then you're going to be way ahead of everybody else. And every option you're going to choose for a career now involves computing. And the better you know that, the better you can do in your field. It's easy. It's an easy sell to the hardcore computer science people
Hmm.
in a school, because they're going to be there whether, they'll be banging your door down
Right.
because they want the courses. Everybody's going to need it to some extent. And I think it's a good point what you say, just about coding for pleasure. It's fun. I mean, if people write or paint or draw or dance, I don't think many people ask them, no, how much are you making at that? Like, what, you'll never be able to support yourself. Well, of course, it brings pleasure and it's self-expression. And so that's good enough, isn't it?
Yeah, for some, not for others.
Yeah.
Some people are really concerned with that, which like I understand to an extent, but it's also like, okay, we don't need to just focus on learning about jobs. Like what about in our
Mhm.
leisure time things to just help us decompress from those jobs?
And I think with the humanities is we're more than the jobs we do as humans.
Right.
And so this is just an aspect of that.
So what's something you believed when you first began working in education that you no longer believe?
I think that I at first didn't really believe in the power of giving students choice.
Hmm. Even in the humanities and
Yeah, I think it was still, no, we're all doing this. We're all doing this book, or we're all writing this essay, that
huh,
kind of thing.
okay.
And perhaps it was simply because I didn't know how to manage multiple things going on. Maybe that scared me. I don't really know. I don't think I came with that kind of a mindset. I don't know. That's a tough question. I probably also underestimated young people when I first started teaching. I think I maybe didn't impute the right motives to them, or thought that if given the chance, they'd slack off and things like that. In my experience, I don't know if you've ever done this, but if you've ever done some self evaluations with students, it's amazing to me how either they're absolutely spot on when they evaluate what they've done and learned, or they're hard on themselves.
Hmm.
Very rarely do you come across the student that says, "Yeah, oh, that's 100," because that's what they want. That very rarely happens. I think that I don't think I understood at the time how, what their standards were, how smart they were, how they really understood what was going on. I don't think I gave them enough credit. So I haven't done that for a while, but I think when I first started, I was like that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's something that I've seen with a lot of educators who are first starting CS. The thing that they're most afraid of is not knowing enough. And that kind of fear can put limitations on the kids in that they don't want them to learn too much, because then how is the teacher going to help them? And that in the end just kind of slows things down.
I just had that happen to me today in class. I was seventh grade class. They're making scratch games, and somebody had come up against kind of this thorny programming problem. And she said, well, what will happen if I do this? And I said, I don't know. And she said, what?
We'll find
I
out.
said, I don't know. I said, but she said, but you're the computers. You're supposed to know everything. I said, I clearly do not know everything. I said, I have a suspicion of what might happen based on working with Scratch and how I think the logic might work, but I don't really know. So I said, try it. Let's see what happens. She tried it, and it came out the way that I thought it might, but I didn't know. And it was funny to see the astonishment
Right.
that she thought I knew everything. And then if I back up and I say, look, I teach 4 grades of middle school computer science with 2 to 3 technologies in each grade. So that's, 8 to 10, 12 different platforms. So I can't possibly know all of it about all of them, and that it changes from year to year.
Right.
So I try to disabuse them of the notion that I'm the fount of all wisdom. It doesn't take too long usually.
What comes to mind when you think of what an engaging learning experience is or environment?
Well, that's really my number one goal for every course that I teach and every class period that I have. Every single one is the total engagement from the students. I can't say that I'm always there, but that's what I want to have happen. I live for those aha moments when the student, it clicks.
Right.
They get the robot on the floor, and it does, after multiple tries, it senses the line and it turns left, or whatever it is, or they get 10 points and it goes to the next level in their game, or the Minecraft Redstone project work. I love those. So I try to find, it's always my first question when I'm looking at what technologies or platforms to use is, will this engage the student? So I look at, the grade level, the interest level, and I will dump something in a heartbeat if it's not engaging. I mean, if there's something that I think will be super engaging and it's not, I'll just dump it, and I won't waste any more time on it. And I think that's one thing that's changed in my teaching over the years, is that I didn't used to do that. I used to, we are going to get through this. This is the plan. We're going to do it.
Right.
Now, if it's not working, I will punt quickly. So I always try to have kind of a loose hold on what we're doing, and a willingness to drop it and go to plan B at all times.
There are so many good points that you just said there. You said, if it's not working for who?
Well, I would say not engaging. So
Okay.
Now that means that, because I think the true learning comes when they're engaged, they care, they want it to work. And so that's when I say if it's not working. So there's so much that I think has to do with engagement and motivation and interest and the want to, or whatever you want to call it, that if you don't have that, well, then it's really just trying to drag rocks up a hill. And I'd rather not do that. If there's another way, another entry point into some concept, let's find that, because I want you to want to get the answer.
It sounds like you're thinking through the perspective of whether or not kids would be engaged. And far too often in education, it's more of a top-down thing where it's like, well, I, as the educator or facilitator in the room, really like this thing, so therefore kids should like it too. So like you and I might be like, oh, this is so cool. Let's do Sonic Pi, and we're going to code music and like make all these really cool compositions or live performances. But a kid who's less interested in music would probably be not as engaged.
I think that's true. And so I try to give them some leeway in that, and that's been, fairly recently. I've tried to give even more choice in terms of what they spend time making projects in. But it's, for instance, like Minecraft. When the first time I saw Minecraft, I was like everybody else. I think this is the dumbest looking, boxy, lousy graphics, the whole thing. How is this possibly getting anybody's attention? But then I saw the engagement factor, and I thought, well, okay, if I can't figure out a way to use this in my classes, then I need to have my teaching license revoked, because the engagement factor is so high, and it continues to be, 10 years in. So, that's what it looks like. And they are creating, and they're thinking, and they're working together, and they're problem solving, and all those things, that those higher level thinking skills that we say we want kids to have, they're using them without me making them use them. So what you asked, what does engagement look like? Well, I think that's what it looks like.
We've had several conversations about what your classes look like, and I've had the privilege of being able to look at a draft for a book that you're working on. But I'm wondering if you could share with everyone what a typical class looks like. So if somebody were to walk into your room, what would they see, hear, experience, etc.?
Okay, well, I have to preface this by one of my favorite quotations, which is, learning is messy. So I would always try to make sure that people understand that true learning really is messy. I mean, I could get everybody lined up in nice, neat rows and have them quietly take notes, but that's not how I would like my classes to work. So usually what happens, if you come in, it could look a little chaotic. It could look really chaotic, actually.
Yeah.
There are times when that chaos is not really good. Most of the times it's good chaos. It's learning, messy chaos. And I'm good with that. I usually give large, deep dive projects, and we'll spend weeks on something. So let's say we meet 3 to 4 times a week, 45 to 50-minute periods. So a project, depending on what grade it's in, could last, 3 or 4 weeks. And everybody, we give a little bit of an intro. I like to give them enough an introduction to whatever platform we're using so they can kind of navigate their way around. Mm-hmm. And I show them the first bits. And then I say, now here's your goal. You have to create this, something, a game, a mini game, a whatever. Go. And then they go. Everybody at that point is kind of at a different stage in their learning. And I encourage people to help other people. So that creates more messy learning chaos, but that's okay. My only rule with helping people is you're not allowed to touch their keyboard or their mouse or their robot. Mm-hmm. You can help, but you can point. You can't take over. And we talk about why that is and how you learn and how we don't want to circumvent their learning. And there's just questions all the time. I do believe in just-in-time learning. Mm-hmm. I think we might have talked about that before.
Yep.
So, for instance, take a concept like variables. I mean, you can give a lesson on variables and say, well, a variable is and go through it, and they give you some examples, and they do some exercises with variables and stuff. But at the end of that, my experience with most middle schoolers, and maybe most people, is they'd say, I get it. So what? I mean, what?
Right.
I mean, I'll jump through the hoops. Okay. Because I want to get a good grade or whatever. But so what? I would rather say, okay, for your Scratch game, you have to have 2 working variables like lives, health, score, time, levels, whatever. You learn about variables and you solve for X. My thought when I was in middle school was, who cares what X is equal to? I mean, really? But now it's like lives equals 10. Oh,
right.
And then I say, so that's a variable. And so they want to learn it because they want to say, oh, but I want to make it so that when my, the cheese puff hits the buffalo 10 times, I go to the next level. And I say, well, now you need what they call a variable. And here's how you do it. And so they're ready. They want to learn it right then. They need to learn it right then. And so that, to me, that's the engaging, that's what you can get, doing it this way. I'm not against some front loading, and I will do it if it seems like it's necessary. If they're just not getting it, and some people do prefer to have it explained ahead of time, and I can do that as well. I do provide support materials, like I have a YouTube channel for some Scratch videos, and I always have handouts and things like that. So they're not left just stumbling around. But I think that the engagement comes when they need to learn that particular concept. That's the strike while the iron is hot moment.
Yeah, there's a professor that I had at ASU named James Paul G. He writes a lot about like discourse analysis and video games and learning, and then something called situated learning. And so one of the things he talks about is like when you're playing a video game, you typically don't get the manual right up front and read through it A to Z and then start playing the game. What happens is in most video games is you'll start playing and you have some kind of a short-term objective like get out of the room that you're in. So you need to figure out how to move, but you don't need to figure out how to cast spells or to throw buckets or whatever it is that you're going to do in the game. But as you keep progressing into the next areas, then you have this new thing that you need to learn and you slowly keep adding upon that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he has some really good points about situated learning. He's got several books on it. If people are interested in it, check it out. But a lot of educators feel this need to like front load. And that's basically like, okay, I'm going to read the entire manual before I actually learn how to walk or how to jump in the video game itself. And it's just not necessary.
I didn't know there was a term for it. That's pretty cool. I'm going to write that down. Situated learning. It'll make it sound really smart when I talk about it later. And I think that's true for so many things. But I think as adults, we like to categorize and all of that. That's really why I have this great quotation. My hero is Seymour Papert,
Mm-hmm.
who's passed on. But I have this quotation up on my board, and he says, "The role of the teacher is to create the conditions for invention rather than provide ready-made knowledge." And I guess if I had to have that's my mantra, that would be it right there. So I try to create in my room, you talk about what's it going to look like. Well, I'm trying to every day create the conditions for invention rather than provide ready-made knowledge. And that's hopefully what it looks like. And hopefully the kids are engaged and interested. And that's usually the case. I would say 90% of the kids, 90% of the time come in excited, sit down and jump right into what they're doing. And that to me means, okay, I think we're getting there.
So with that being said, if you were after the end of this year, all of a sudden asked to go teach at a brand new school in a new location with kids that you've never seen before, what are some of the like things that you would take into consideration or plan to design for in the class that you would try and create?
Well, I don't think I would change much about my approach off the bat because I've seen it work. I believe that it works. Until these new students proved otherwise, I would go with that. I guess I would say, well, where are they and what is the thing that engages them? And I think I also try to provide a variety of entry points into computer science.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's the CSDA says the middle school is about exploration and discovery. So I really try to have, okay, we're going to do some physical computing. We're going to do some robotics. We're going to do some game design. We'll do some creative coding. We'll do some, and hopefully some Minecraft. Hopefully something in there is going to snag a kid. They'll at least find one or two things that clicks for me. I try to have a variety of entry points into computer science. You just hope that some kid will, man, that one really worked for me. And try to create whatever they need to have that conditions for invention there, give them as much front loading as it seems that they're going to need, and then let them go and then support as they go.
And how do you typically support kids as they go?
Well, okay. So I do, I do a couple of things. One is I have a help list on my board and I have kids sign up on the help list and I try to get to them in order on the list. I try to tell them, look, if I spend 5 minutes with each person and the class is 45 minutes long, that's 9 people. If you're 10th on the list, guess what? So I have another thing on my board, which says ask 3 before me.
Mm-hmm.
Always do that. And I try to run it that way. And the other thing that I do sometimes is I put another list next to the help list, which is if you know how to do something and you're willing to help people, put that on this other help list and say, I can help with a timer or and then when you come up to put your name on the help list, see is there somebody there who knows this? Or I say, just get out of your seat and say, who knows how to do the timer? Who knows? And get somebody to help you. And then, and that's kind of exciting too, because then a lot of times it's a student who might not think of themselves as the best coder or anything like that, but they know how to do something. And they get a chance to shine. They get to be the expert. And I think that's gold. And I also have handouts. I call them, it's hack packs for each unit of each project, which has hints and tips in there. I've got some videos on YouTube. I need to build that out more, but I try not to just leave them floundering, but it's a training period for them to learn how to help themselves and how to help each other in the absence of Mr. Irving being right there. So
yeah, and you're encouraging them to kind of cultivate their own individualized expertise in something that's interesting to them. And that's another thing that G actually talks about in a lot of his writings, is like how valuable that is going to be in the future. It's not about knowing the same thing as everyone else around you. It's having something that you can contribute to a team that others don't know about.
Oh, I like that. I heard somebody say once, and I have used this with some students, it's not how smart are you, it's how are you smart. I mean, I don't know. I'm in an independent school, and there's a very kind of specific way of looking at grades and all of that in an independent school that's perhaps not like other schools, but it's very, it's very competitive. It's very, and it's a very narrow slice of learning. I mean, I've had students who really didn't do well in some of the academic subjects, but they were geniuses in mechanical intelligence.
Yeah.
They could pick up the Raspberry Pi and they know exactly what goes where and how to put it all together. And so that person has a skill that other people don't have, that we're not really asking for in our curriculum, but doesn't mean it's not useful.
Yeah. When I left the classroom to join Boot Up full-time, there was a fourth grade teacher at the school who ended up taking over the coding classes that I was doing. And when I went and visited, he was saying how he really saw kids in a different way, because he had seen them years prior when they took his class when they're in fourth grade. And when he saw them in this environment, if they might have struggled in his class with the language arts and reading and things like that, they might like excel and be some of the best programmers in the school in the coding classes.
And I think it's great to have that so kids can shine.
Yep.
But I get feedback. I mean, I can't say that I'm batting 1,000, but I hear from many, many students, oh, it's our favorite class. We love this. It's, you get to do whatever, it's,
right.
And it's the other phrase I've stolen from Seymour Papert is hard fun, and that's what I tell them they're in for in my class. It's hard fun. It's hard, but it's fun. And, Papert's thing was kids don't hate school because it's hard. They hate it because it's boring. They don't mind hard. They really don't. If it means something and it's fun, and by fun, I think, we could say engaging perhaps in this context.
Yeah.
It's okay. They don't mind it. I mean, you look at what, what kids do in games. Are you kidding? They will do it over and over and over and over again to master it. It's hard, but they're not complaining that it's boring. So I think we miss something in education by denigrating video games and all of that.
Yeah, and to add on a point that you made earlier, if you are new to CS, maybe just try implementing one new thing or new technology or platform every semester, or maybe even just every year. You don't have to do all of it all up front. So like I had several languages in my class by the time I left, but we started with one the first day that I was there.
Yes.
So you can gradually build off of that.
That's a really good point. And I guess I hadn't thought about that, but that is actually how I did it. I mean, I built up based on stuff that I had done before, and it got me going. And then I kind of built out from there. But yeah, one new thing, a quarter, a semester, a year, one change in a unit is the best way to go, because then you'll know I think it is a recipe for disaster to try to implement multiple things all at once.
Right. Now, I have had some conversations with some administrators who are used to seeing every kid working on the same thing at the same time in a shared space. So what might you communicate to an administrator who kind of like walked into your class and like this is their first time seeing kids working on several different projects in different ways all at once?
The first thing that comes to mind is that other way of doing things. That's the industrial model, right? The factory model. And that was great, I suppose, when you were preparing kids to work in factories their whole lives, doing the same thing all at the same time. But as we know, those jobs are gone. So look at any workplace today. If I mean, I suppose it would depend what that administrator's goals are, but if their goals are, we want to prepare our students for the workplace, find me a workplace where everybody is doing the same thing at the same time, individually, together. I don't think you'll be able to find, I can't think of anything. So they have to learn how to work alongside other people that are doing other things.
Yeah, I think that's an extremely valuable point. It kind of goes back to the cultivating individualized expertise and whatnot.
Yeah, because I mean, the other thing, and I had this little talk with one of my classes. I said, statistics seem to indicate that you, eighth graders, in your lifetimes will have, between whatever, 2 and 5 careers,
Right.
whatever I don't know how they come up with this and what the number is now. But I said, that's not jobs, that's separate careers. So you have to, that learning how to learn and adjust on the fly and individualized instruction and learning, that's what you're going to need to succeed in this world.
So what do you wish there was more research on that could inform your own practices?
I guess I would like to see, now that you've told me what it is, situated learning. I really think, and I could be totally wrong about this, but I don't think I am, but how much research is there on gaming and learning and the crossover? Like, what can we as educators learn from what game designers know about how people learn, and building in motivation and individual paths and all that kind of stuff, because I think that would be super helpful. A lot of people, I mean, I think the research would be pretty persuasive if you're a serious educator, if they could say, here's what we learned about how kids learn in games. Here's what could work in a classroom or in a learning situation. I'd love to see that.
Yeah, there is a growing amount of research on that. I'm just going to kind of throw out some names, and I'll put some of the Google Scholar profiles in the show notes. Like James Paul G is one of them. I already mentioned him. Kurt Squire is another. Constance Steinkuhler, Sasha Barab. So like there's a lot of people who are doing this kind of research and who are looking at this like intersection of video games and learning.
Mm-hmm.
There's more. It's just there's not a lot of discussion about it other than gamification of computer science and whatnot, which I would argue is kind of basically just putting extrinsic motivators, generally speaking, into a game format.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know if this is even relevant to the question you asked, but I had a discussion with somebody that were talking about, an administrator in my school said, I don't get this, how kids can watch YouTube videos of other kids playing games. Like, what's with that? And I said, well, do you ever watch, football or basketball games? Yeah. Well, those are other people that, they're playing basketball and you're watching them play.
Yep.
So
you could go do that
difference?
too.
He said, oh, well, I guess when you put it like that, I don't know. It's a form of learning in a way, there's something about that. But I guess, as far as the research question goes, that's the thing that would occur to me.
You have an approach to education that is working really well with the kids that you are with.
Mm-hmm.
How are you continuing to try and refine that each year? In what way is your pedagogy like iterative or just constantly developing?
Well, I have every student in the middle school for a quarter, which is 9 weeks-ish. And so every quarter, I start all over again. So I iterate that curriculum 4 times a year. And inevitably, quarter 2 is a little bit different from quarter 1 and quarter 3, because sometimes, as I go through it, something, and of course, if you've ever taught multiple sections of the same course on the same day, that, you could have the most amazing lesson, the first period of the day, the same lesson 2 periods later, and it just crashes and burns. So, I kind of try to take that into account as I iterate, that sometimes just some things just don't work with particular groups. Even though I have this, okay, here's what we're going to do, I'm still willing to modify how we do it based on the group that's sitting there in that classroom. If it's obvious that whatever I thought worked for the last several years, whatever I was selling, these kids aren't buying it, and
right.
You always have to iterate. I mean, and so my curriculum is always in flux, always. And I'm lucky in a way that I get to iterate it 4 times a year, because that's 4 times through, okay, this really, really worked. And this worked, with every single group that I had. This worked with most of the groups. This didn't work at all with anybody. And so I'm always kind of, fiddling with it around the margins, next time through, to see, okay, that's good. So it's a learning experience for me.
Yeah, I think that constant reflection on how things are going is very valuable. One of the things that I really like to do is also videotape just like put the camera in like the corner of the room so it kind of shows the whole room, and just I would go back and watch the videos of the classes that did not
Mm,
go well, and I would just
mm,
be constantly asking, well, what could I have done differently, or
mm.
what was I unaware of that was going on in the room, that like kind of made it so it wasn't as great of a lesson. If you're able to record in your class, that can be a very helpful tool. And that was directed at like people listening, not towards you.
Well, then I could benefit from it too. I think that there's always you can always get better.
Right.
I mean, and the other thing you have to remember too, and this is, one of those chestnuts, but I think it's especially true in middle school. We teach people, not subjects. They're all individuals as well. And so I try to vary my interactions with students according to what is going to work for them. I do a lot of individual interaction because there's not a lot of me talking, them taking notes. And I try to find out, so what's working for her, what's working for him, and what do they respond to, and does that person not respond to. So it's a constant evaluation, I find, for me anyway.
Yeah. So what questions have I not asked that you would like to discuss?
Where do you get your inspirations for teaching, and it's particularly teaching computer science? And for me, I would say most of the inspirations, I mentioned Seymour Papert, who really is my hero, and his book Mindstorms. And the other one's called, I think it's the child's computer, the children and computers. I can't remember what it's called. This guy was doing this kind of stuff in the 70s,
Mm-hmm.
which is just unfathomable that he was doing this. And he really laid the groundwork for this approach. And it's kind of a constructivist, if you want to put a label on it, approach in computer science. And that's why I really like what he did. So if somebody wants some philosophical underpinning for this kind of thing, I would highly recommend his books. And I have another book that's been my inspiration called The Tao of Teaching, like the TAO Tao of Teaching, by a woman named Greta Nagel. And that's not about computer science at all, but it's about teaching, and it's about kind of applying. It sounds kind of silly, but it's these short chapters on Taoist approaches to philosophy and life, and different people that use them in their classrooms. And she has somebody who teaches elementary school, and somebody who teaches high school, and somebody who teaches college. And she takes a quotation from the Tao Te Ching for each chapter and talks about how it works. And that's been, in terms of my own personal approach to teaching in the last 15, 20 years, that's been my Bible. I mean, I have almost every line underlined in that book, and I like to revisit it once or twice a year.
It's funny you mentioned Tao. I have around my neck a charm that is the kanji for Tao. And then I have a tattoo that's like on my side that takes up most of my side that is the kanji for Tao.
Is that right?
In Japanese, it's do or michi, means like the way or path. So that's a big part of my way of being.
Sounds like if you've got a tattoo that large of the kanji, it might be your kind of book.
Yeah, odds are.
Yeah.
What kind of questions do you wish the field would explore more?
Well, this is probably going to be an unpopular thing, but I'm not. I mean, I get standards and I get the need for them, but I sometimes wonder if it's kind of choking the life out of our topic. And I get that we want to make sure that they understand these concepts, and they broaden their understanding of them and all that. I get that, but I would just love to see us not approach it through that funnel. And of course, maybe that's just me wanting school to be fun and all about learning and everybody on fire for learning all the time. And perhaps that's just not really realistic. But I hate to see, today we're going to talk about Boolean variables. Do you know anything about the UK computer science curriculum and how that developed and where they are now with it? When they made it mandatory, right?
Hmm.
I seem to recall reading something in the last few months that they were kind of disappointed with the outcome in terms of kids graduating and how many were going into computer science and all that kind of thing, that it wasn't as, I don't know, as effective as they thought it was going to be. Do you know anything about that?
No, I hadn't heard that kind of an update. Did they indicate what they thought was the reason for that?
Well, if that is what happened, I'm sure everybody has a different take on it and
Right.
why it is. So I don't really know, but I'm wondering if they made it a little bit too prescriptive and less exploratory,
Yeah.
if it's just one more thing that the kids got to do, whereas it could be engaging and fun. But I'm actually the person that thinks that any subject could be this engaging and fun if you modified your approach to it. I don't think there's any subject that has to be innately boring.
Since you voiced what I believe you called an unpopular opinion, I'll kind of add on to that. I question the value of making so many subjects mandatory across the
Mhm.
curriculum because I get the feeling that a lot of teachers kind of do this coverage approach with I need to make sure I
Yeah.
hit all the standards, and then they don't
Mhm.
actually really dive into what's interesting about a subject
Mhm.
area, or they're not
Mhm.
able to because they can only go an inch deep and a mile wide.
Yes.
So for me, I think it'd be interesting if we kind of honestly moved away from requiring everyone to learn 20 different subject areas and instead opening it up and saying, well, what do you actually want to learn and dive deep in to develop your own individualized expertise?
I love that. I like the way you think.
Thanks.
I mean, the other thing is that Finland, which never ceases to fascinate me and amaze me, their educational system, didn't they just say they were going to do away with subjects?
Oh, I hadn't heard that. That'd be interesting.
Yeah,
They're just trying to break the silos or something?
I think so. I'm not
Okay.
really sure, but I thought, wow, that's brave, because I'm not even sure what I think about that, but
Huh.
I'm sure that they're probably trying to go in the direction that you're advocating, which is let's dive deep into stuff that really interests us. And then we can see all the interconnections, because then you have like oh, well, that's math. So we can't, and that's art, or that's science. And so we can't talk about that here because that's
Right.
everybody grows up with those silos firmly implanted in their heads. And, the reality is that it's all interconnected.
Yeah, and if anyone's listening and is interested, my dissertation kind of talks about this in chapter 5 and 6. So I looked at this discussion forum and there's like over 10,000 members in it. And the way that they're engaging with music was with old video game hardware and software. And so they would like take apart like a Nintendo Entertainment System and then like write new software for it. And then they would create live music with that. And when they were engaging in that, it was in like this transdisciplinary way, and that the problem that they were trying to solve was I want to make music with this thing that typically isn't made for performing live music.
Mm.
And so to do that, they had to engage in a lot of hardware and software practices relevant to computer science. They engaged in a lot of visual art practices, entrepreneurial stuff when they went and sold their music, like all these different subject areas all combined around this one form of engagement, which was
Mm.
making chip tunes.
Oh, all right.
And so it would be really interesting to see what that kind of experience would look like in a formalized setting, like what you're describing.
That's fascinating. I guess the question you'd have to find out is, though, do you need areas of expertise like subject matter experts for all of those things? If you're going to say, well, we've got these two kids in the school and they want to do chip tunes and
Mm-hmm.
that's their passion. So do they have a faculty sponsor, or how does that work, and what does that individual know or not know about Nintendo systems and their sound chips and whatever language they use to program in and all that, and, sound synthesis and all of that? Where are those people that know all that have that subject matter expertise? Or is Do they not need those people?
It's distributed. So I'm citing G a lot in this, but G writes a lot about affinity spaces. And so an online affinity space is like geographically and time-wise, there's like no separation. If you're able to go online, like you can communicate asynchronously with anyone across the world. And because of that, you're able to kind of utilize expertise from different areas. So in a space like that, you might not need to have a faculty member, staff member, whatever, who has an expertise in that area, but you need to somewhere be able to network to people or resources outside of the space itself. So like just being able to search online for resources and how to do something, and then to have somebody there to kind of help guide through some of those processes might help.
So then you need people who, there's this whole division between teaching and learning, right?
Mm-hmm.
You need people who are experts in learning, who aren't necessarily teachers, I suppose.
Actually, there is a school, if I remember correctly, it's called like Sudbury. It's a model of school where like everybody has a say in everything. So like a kindergartner can like yay or nay a like budget approval just as much as like a staff member can. And when kids go into the school, they choose what they want to learn, when they want to learn. And like one of the famous stories that came out of it was this kid who like showed up every day and for like 2 years straight was just like, I want to go fishing. And so would just like fish at the river that was at the back end of the school. And then one day was just like, all right, I want to learn astrophysics or like some other like completely out of the blue subject area. And so they talk about how when given these kind of environments, what they called staff members had to approach it differently, in that you're there to really kind of help them with their learning, not to teach them the information, but to kind of like guide them towards the information and whatnot. And while that's on like one end of the spectrum in terms of like progressive land, it's something that we can at least look at and go, okay, what can I take from this and potentially apply into the classrooms that I'm working with?
Well, I think you need some really forward-thinking people willing to experiment.
Yeah.
Experimenting is kind of tricky when you have, the students are the subjects. You want to make sure that they get what they need, and
right.
If your experiment fails and they don't, then that's not good. So maybe that's where we can have you asked me what research, could be brought to bear on this. So maybe that's an area, so that we don't just kind of try to figure it out with live subjects.
Yeah, I mean, on that note, I will say that there's this interesting disconnect between computer science education research and educational research outside of computer science. There's this tendency to kind of try and reinvent the wheel or do things that were already done decades ago and have been since abandoned for a variety of reasons. But computer scientists, scholars don't necessarily always know that, if all they're doing is just kind of reading within the field itself. So if there's one thing that I can really recommend for educators and education scholars in general, is just read outside of the field. So read outside of not just CS education, but even education itself. Like G doesn't necessarily always talk about education, and I've learned a lot from him on this. Another person, Henry Jenkins, is a media scholar, and I've learned a lot about education from him, and he's in media studies. So basically, the moral of the story, read a lot. Where can people go to kind of connect with you and to learn more from you?
Twitter is my main thing. So my Twitter handle is at BIRV2, BIRV2. I've got my small number of Scratch videos are on YouTube. I do hope to keep building out my channel. And my thing there is Crouching Python, all one word, capital C, capital P. So those are the places where I hang out the most for learning.
And that concludes this week's episode of the CSK8 podcast. I hope you got as much out of it as I did. I really enjoyed this conversation with Bob, and I look forward to many more down the road. I hope you consider following him on Twitter and subscribing to him on YouTube. I will have the links for that in the show notes. Speaking of, just as a friendly reminder, you should be able to access the show notes in your podcast app. Otherwise, you can find all of them at jaredoleary.com. If you haven't done so yet, I highly recommend using the CSK8 hashtag and sharing resources and asking questions on social media on various platforms. I hope you enjoyed this week's show, and I hope you tune in next week for an episode where I unpack some more scholarship. Thank you so much for listening.